Welcome to DRM News Podcast. We try to cover the most important stories of the day, but every so often something happens that's just so bizarre it grabs everyone's attention.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got today, a plane crash at Scottsdale Airport in Arizona that's got, well, everyone talking.
It's not just the crash itself, it's a whole situation. We've got a rock star's plane, a landing gone wrong, and a string of other recent aviation incidents across the U.S. It makes you wonder if something bigger is going on.
Okay, yeah. So let's break this down. We've got three main sources painting the picture for us: the Associated Press, AZ Family, and TMZ, each adding a different angle to the story. So first, what do we know for sure? The Associated Press gave us the basic facts. On Monday, February 10th, 2025, two private jets collided at Scottsdale Airport. One of them, a Learjet, was landing when it suddenly veered off the runway and smashed into a parked Gulfstream jet.
Wow.
Sadly, there was at least one fatality and several injuries reported.
What's really strange here is that the Learjet veered off after landing. That's not your typical crash scenario. It suggests a loss of control at a point when the plane should be slowing down and preparing to taxi. The AP report mentions possible landing gear failure. And if you think about it, that makes sense. A landing gear malfunction could definitely throw off the plane's balance and make it nearly impossible to stay on the runway.
Okay, so that's the technical side of things. But then TMZ and AZ Family throw in this curveball. They both reveal that the Learjet was owned by Vince Neil, the frontman for Mötley Crüe.
And that adds a whole other layer to this whole thing because aircraft ownership is a big deal in aviation accident investigations.
Oh.
It can affect who's held responsible, insurance claims, the whole nine yards. So the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, is going to have to dig into that as well.
Wait, NTSB, for our listeners who might not be familiar with all the aviation jargon, can you explain what the NTSB is and what their role is in all of this?
Sure. The NTSB is kind of like the detective agency for plane crashes. They're the ones who come in, gather all the evidence, analyze the data from the flight recorders, which are like the plane's black boxes, and interview witnesses to figure out exactly what happened and why.
So they're not just there to point fingers, but to figure out how to prevent something like this from happening again.
Exactly. They'll issue a final report with their findings and recommendations, which can have a big impact on aviation regulations, training, even how planes are designed.
Got it. So back to Vince Neil. TMZ says that while he wasn't on the plane, his girlfriend and her friend were.
And that's where we start to see the human impact of this crash. TMZ reports that Nee's girlfriend suffered broken ribs, which really brings home the seriousness of this incident. And we have to remember, even those with less severe physical injuries might still be dealing with the emotional and psychological trauma of surviving a plane crash.
Right.
It's a terrifying experience, to say the least.
Absolutely. We're talking about a potentially life-altering event, and it sounds like the community's really feeling this as well. Scottsdale Mayor Lisa Borowski and Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays both released statements expressing their condolences and offering support to everyone affected.
What's particularly interesting is that the AP article mentions this crash comes on the heels of several other aviation disasters in the U.S. in just the past few weeks. There was a collision between a commercial jet and an Army helicopter near Washington, D.C., a medical transport plane crash, and a commuter plane crash in Alaska.
Wow. So this Scottsdale crash isn't an isolated incident. It's happening against a backdrop of what seems like a growing number of aviation accidents. That's definitely unsettling.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions. Are these just unfortunate coincidences, or is there a deeper systemic problem within the aviation industry that needs to be addressed?
That's a question the NTSB will need to grapple with as they investigate, right?
Exactly. They're going to be looking for any common factors or trends that might connect these recent crashes. Are there issues with pilot training, maintenance practices, air traffic control? These are all possibilities the NTSB will need to explore.
So we've got this seemingly random plane crash in Scottsdale, but it's actually part of a much larger and potentially troubling story unfolding across the nation.
It definitely seems that way. And that makes the NTSB's job even more important. They need to figure out if there are any underlying issues that are contributing to this increase in aviation accidents, and if so, what can be done to fix them.
So they're not just trying to solve this one case in Scottsdale, they're trying to prevent future disasters across the board.
Right. Their findings could have far-reaching consequences for the entire aviation industry.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, but let's zoom back in on this specific crash in Scottsdale. What are some of the unique challenges the NTSB might face in investigating this particular incident?
Well, as we discussed, the fact that the Learjet veered off the runway after landing makes things tricky. It's not your typical crash scenario, so they'll need to figure out exactly when and why the pilot lost control. Was it during touchdown? A problem with the braking system? A sudden gust of wind? They'll need to consider all of these possibilities.
Plus, you've got the parked Gulf Stream that was hit. That adds another layer of complexity.
Exactly. They'll need to determine if the position or condition of the Gulf Stream played any role in the severity of the crash. It's like a giant, twisted jigsaw puzzle, and they have to carefully piece it all back together.
And they're using every tool in their arsenal to do it right.
Absolutely. They'll be combing through the wreckage, analyzing the flight data recorders, the black boxes, reviewing air traffic control communications, studying weather data, interviewing witnesses, anything that could shed light on what happened.
Speaking of the investigation, those initial reports suggesting landing gear failure are definitely concerning.
If that turns out to be the case, the NTSB will be diving deep into the maintenance records of that Learjet. Was there a pre-existing problem with the landing gear? Were proper maintenance procedures followed? Could it have been something like metal fatigue or even a manufacturing defect? These are all questions they'll be investigating.
And they'll also be looking at the pilot's actions, right?
Of course. Even if there was a mechanical issue like landing gear failure, the NTSB will still scrutinize the pilot's response. Did they follow proper procedures? Were there any errors in judgment that might have contributed to the crash?
It's a reminder that pilot training and decision-making are critical, even when dealing with mechanical problems.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important point. This crash happened during the Waste Management Phoenix Open, a major golf tournament that draws huge crowds to Scottsdale.
So the airport was probably extra busy, which could have added to the pressure and complexity of the situation.
Exactly. Increased air traffic means more strain on air traffic controllers, more planes taking off and landing, more potential for things to go wrong. The NTSB will definitely be looking into whether the increased traffic played any role in this incident.
It's a good reminder that even though flying is statistically very safe, there are always risks involved.
That's right. And those risks can be amplified during busy periods or when unexpected events occur.
Let's talk about the immediate aftermath of the crash. The Scottsdale Airport was shut down for several hours, which must have caused significant disruption.
Absolutely. Air traffic was diverted, flights were delayed, and countless travelers were inconvenienced. It highlights the ripple effect these incidents have on the entire transportation system.
And beyond the immediate logistical disruptions, there's the impact on the airport's reputation and the community's sense of safety.
You're right. People might be hesitant to fly through Scottsdale if they perceive it as being unsafe.
So what can the airport do to address those concerns?
Transparency is key. They need to be open and honest about the investigation, share updates with the public, and demonstrate their commitment to safety.
And they also need to show compassion for the victims and their families.
Absolutely. Offering support services, counseling, and financial assistance are all important steps in the healing process.
Speaking of the investigation, what role does the FAA play in all of this? I know they're the ones who regulate aviation in the U.S., but how do they work with the NTSB?
The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the NTSB have distinct but complementary roles. The NTSB is focused on determining the cause of this specific crash, while the FAA is looking at the broader implications for aviation safety across the country.
So they're both working toward the same goal, making flying safer, but from different angles.
Exactly. They'll be sharing information and expertise throughout the investigation. The FAA might even implement new regulations or change existing ones based on the NTSB's findings.
Got it. So it's a collaborative effort, but each organization has its own area of focus.
That's right. They're both vital pieces of the puzzle when it comes to aviation safety.
Yeah, let's talk about Vince Neil again. I know he wasn't on the plane, but this must be weighing heavily on him. His girlfriend was injured, and a life was lost in this crash.
It is tragedy no matter how you look at it, and even though Vince Neil wasn't personally involved in the crash itself, he's still connected to it through his ownership of the aircraft. It's a situation that brings a lot of emotional baggage.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these incidents affect not just the people on board, but their loved ones as well.
And it also highlights the importance of supporting everyone who has been impacted by this crash, whether they were directly involved or not.
The Scottsdale community has really stepped up in that regard, haven't they?
They have. There's been an outpouring of support for the victims' families. donations to relief efforts, and messages of condolence. It's heartwarming to see people coming together in times of tragedy.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the desire to help others in need, and the importance of community.
Exactly. These are the qualities that help us navigate through difficult times and emerge stronger on the other side.
Speaking of navigating through difficult times, this crash has sparked a lot of anxiety and concern about flying in general.
It's understandable. When you see a string of aviation accidents like we've had recently, it's natural to start questioning whether flying is as safe as we thought it was.
So how do we balance those concerns with the reality that flying is still statistically one of the safest ways to travel?
That's a good question, and it's one that deserves a thoughtful answer. It's important to acknowledge those fears and anxieties, to validate them, but also to provide context and reassurance.
And that's where clear and accurate information is so important, right?
Absolutely. We need to rely on credible sources like the NTSB and the FAA to provide us with the facts, to explain what happened, and to outline the steps being taken to prevent future accidents.
And we need to avoid sensationalism and speculation, which can often fuel those anxieties and create unnecessary fear.
Right. We need to focus on the facts, the data, and the evidence, and trust the experts who are working tirelessly to make air travel as safe as possible.
So while we can't eliminate all risks, we can take steps to minimize them and make informed decisions about our travel choices.
Exactly. We can choose reputable airlines with good safety records, pay attention to pre-flight safety briefings, and familiarize ourselves with emergency procedures.
And we can support the work of organizations like the NTSB and the FAA, who are dedicated to making flying safer for everyone. It's easy to get caught up in the statistics and the investigations, but we can't forget that real people are dealing with unimaginable loss and trauma right now.
That's so important to remember. We've talked about a lot of technical details, but ultimately this crash had a profound impact on individuals, families, friends, and even the first responders who witnessed the aftermath.
Thinking about those first responders, they're often overlooked in these situations, but they're the ones who have to deal with the immediate chaos and trauma.
It's a heavy burden to carry. Seeing that wreckage, tending to injuries, and knowing that lives were lost, it can leave scars that aren't always visible.
We often hear about PTSD in relation to military veterans, but first responders are exposed to a lot of the same kinds of trauma.
Exactly. And it's crucial that we provide them with the same level of care and support. They need access to counseling services, peer support networks, and resources that help them cope with the emotional and psychological toll of their work.
It's about recognizing that their well-being is just as important as the physical safety of those they're helping.
Absolutely. They put their lives on the line for us, so we need to make sure they have the support they need to process those experiences and move forward in a healthy way.
Shifting gears a bit, this crash has also sparked a lot of discussion about the role of the media in covering these types of incidents.
It's a tricky situation, isn't it? On the one hand, the public has a right to know what happened, and the media plays a vital role in keeping people informed.
Transparency is crucial, especially when it comes to aviation safety. But there's a fine line between reporting the facts and sensationalizing a tragedy.
Exactly. When media coverage focuses on the most shocking or emotional aspects of the story, it can amplify fear and anxiety among the public, which isn't helpful.
Plus, there's always the risk of speculation and misinformation spreading like wildfire, especially on social media.
It's more important than ever to rely on credible news sources, to be critical of what we read and hear, and to wait for the facts to emerge from the official investigation.
Speaking of the investigation, this crash is just one piece of a larger puzzle. We've talked about those other recent aviation incidents, the helicopter and jet collision, the medical transport plane crash, the commuter plane crash in Alaska. It's hard not to see those as part of a larger trend, and it makes people wonder if there are systemic issues that need to be addressed within the aviation industry.
Yeah.
The NTSB's investigation will hopefully shed some light on that. If they find common threads running through these accidents, their recommendations could lead to significant changes.
Exactly. They might identify problems with pilot training, aircraft maintenance, air traffic control procedures, or even the regulatory framework itself.
Their findings could have far-reaching implications, not just for the U.S., but for aviation safety globally.
And that's why it's so important that their investigation is thorough, independent, and transparent.
Now, looking ahead, what are some of the key lessons we can take away from this tragedy, both as individuals and as a society?
For me, it's a reminder that safety in all aspects of our lives is something we can never take for granted.
It's easy to go through our days on autopilot, not really thinking about the risks we face. But this crash forces us to confront that reality.
It reminds us that accidents can happen even in highly regulated industries like aviation. And it underscores the importance of continuous improvement, of always striving to make things safer and more reliable.
It also highlights the interconnectedness of our world. This crash had ripple effects that extended far beyond Scottsdale. It disrupted travel plans, impacted businesses, and made people question the safety of flying in general.
It's a reminder that we're all part of a larger system, and that our actions or inactions can have consequences that reach far beyond ourselves.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the Scottsdale plane crash, I think it's fitting to end on a note of hope, despite the tragedy we've discussed.
I agree. Even in the face of immense loss and grief, we've also seen incredible resilience, compassion, and a determination to learn from this experience and make things better.
The Scottsdale community has come together to support the victims' families, and the aviation industry is committed to investigating the crash thoroughly and implementing necessary changes to prevent future tragedies.
This incident has sparked important conversations about aviation safety, and hopefully those conversations will lead to meaningful action.
So while we mourn those who were lost and offer our support to those who are hurting, let's also channel that grief into a collective effort to make flying safer for everyone.
And let's remember that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, there's always a path forward, and there's always the possibility of positive change.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Scottsdale plane crash. We'll continue to follow the NTSB investigation and bring you updates as they become available. Until then, fly safe, everyone.